Grave Digger Queen here. I'm gonna take a little time out from working the bone pile and tell y'all a story around the campfire. As a grave digger, whoever breaks their back the best is who I like. So when Grave Digger Queen saw this story, she had to tell it. The name of this story is Immigrants Find Work at a Church Cult by Montsho Shelby. I will see you at the end, children. I'm a night guard at the Church of Hope, which is located out in the middle of nowhere. I won't lie to you and say the place isn't beautiful because it absolutely is a modern marvel, though the irony is that most people never see it. It is a temple amidst a gorgeous garden constructed in the 1990s by some eccentric architect that I never bothered to learn the name of. I work here, but I am by no means of the faith. It's just me and Al, who comes out at night, watches a few cameras in a guard shack, walks around 3 or 4 times, and then the night's over. If I'm being honest, most nights I watch movies or YouTube in the downtime, and there is plenty. The grounds are huge, and 2 guys on rotating nights is barely enough to watch it all. But our function isn't to stop things from happening on the grounds, but call the cops when it does. My shift starts at 10 and ends at 6. We don't get relieved with the morning shift or greeted by an afternoon shift. The night shift is the only shift there is. I've been here about 5 years and Al has been here about 10. I was told that before me, it was a revolving door of people coming in to do the job, and I can see why. Sure, the pay is good, and unlike most jobs, you don't have co-workers and supervisors hovering over you, but it's absolute isolation that will weigh on your mind. For people who don't know how to relax and let the hours melt away from the clock, this job is torture, but for people like me, that never has been an issue. Sometimes the sounds you hear from the beast in the garden are enough to chill you to your core, and to that I say, buy AirPods. What nature does or doesn't do is none of my business. Recently, Al quit, or more so retired. He was pushing deep into his upper 60s as it was, and he put in his 10 years, so now the management asked me to work every night of the week, but at time and a half. I agreed to this arrangement and was absolutely certain they weren't willing to do that on a regular basis, so they would indeed find someone to replace Al very rapidly. After a week of straight to work, I began to notice people being shown into the temple. I do not particularly recall when any of them left, but I assumed it must have been early in the morning when I wasn't there. I didn't think much on it because I figured they were just casting a wide net, snagging whoever they managed to get to fill in for Al. As much as I did patrol the grounds and the exterior of the building, I typically never ventured inside of the church. I had the keys to open the doors in emergencies, but they asked me not to enter unless it was something not important enough for the police, but not so trivial that it wouldn't need a look. I knew the interior layout fairly well, even though I'd only actually been in the building a few times. Tonight, the cameras went out in the church. I couldn't in good conscience just call the cops for cameras going out. What if it turned out to be a few loose wires, which it more than likely was, but I couldn't assume it. In 5 years, I had only been in the building 3 times, once when I got hired, once when I was asked to open the temple for some out-of-town members who couldn't see the temple any other time, and lastly was when a camera went out last year. The camera that faced the main lobby went out, and the one that had a good view of the northern door. I was pretty sure I could look at the camera on the northern door because it wasn't high up. Though I knew for a fact I'd need a ladder to get to the camera overlooking the main lobby. I wasn't a repairman, so no one expected me to solve the problem. But seeing I was present, I may as well just check it out to make sure it wasn't something simple like the camera fell out of place or a bug was blocking it. I wasn't very familiar with the twists and turns this place took because I never went inside, but anything that was presented on camera, I knew. Though I had every right to be here, I felt like I was a criminal breaking in. Very unwelcomed. Even though there was no one there to say so, it was as if I felt this place's contempt. The architecture of the building was odd. It had MC Escher-esque turns that defied logic. As I ventured to put the ladder away, I heard whispers coming my way. My gut told me to step in the closet and avoid it until I could get a handle on what it was. I didn't have a gun, so if someone who broke in had a weapon, I pretty much was either running or gonna get fucked up. I cracked the closet door when the footsteps intensified. It was Helen Yarborough, walking two guys with rather outdated and dirty clothes towards the main auditorium. I thought to throw open the door and just announce my presence, but I held back for a second too long enough that me jumping out of the closet would seem weird. Once they went into another area, I'd hop out so they could see me going into the closet, not necessarily hiding in it. They walked down a long hallway. I heard Helen speaking Spanish, which they in turn spoke back. I think I heard one of the guys say trabajo, which I know meant work, so these were probably new hires that were more comfortable speaking Spanish than they were English. If they were interviewing two, then maybe they meant to have 3 night watchmen, which would cut into my hours, but by the same note might free me up to do other things. Me and Al's schedules overlapped 2 days out of the week, and for the most part, he did what he did, and I did what I did. We only interacted when we both got engrossed in a movie together, otherwise it was hi and bye, but not in a dickish way. I saw them disappear into a room that I was about to go into. When I emerged from the closet, I slowly walked into the auditorium, making sure to be loud so I wouldn't startle anyone. My feet echoed off the huge walls. I hoped to run into them naturally, maybe even get to talk to the potential new hires or explain why I was in the building at all, but I didn't see them. It was as if they disappeared. I stomped a bit louder so they could hear me coming, but all I heard was my echo. I didn't want to get nosy because minding my business was my nature, but for the sake of being a security guard, there was a level of curiosity that was required to do the job. I took out my flashlight and scoured the huge room. I ventured behind the curtains, then checked the 2 doors in the back behind the stage. What I really didn't want to see was Helen getting banged by these guys doing kinky sex shit, because 90% of the things I did have to break up was that. People seemed to get ideas when they thought they were all alone, never realizing that in this technical world, there was always someone watching you, even when you thought you were alone. I got to the back room and flashed my light over a wardrobe rack, praying to God they weren't behind it doing who knows what. There were black and red robes that I suppose they used for their services, though I rarely got to witness any of those at the time of night I worked. As I turned away back towards the door, I saw a sliver of light faintly outlining the cracks of a wall. At this point, I didn't think I wanted to know anymore, and the me who wasn't on the job would have let it go. But for the sake of not saying I didn't, I gave it a quick once-over. The light seeped out of the crack in the wall and was barely visible. I pushed the plaster in slightly and a secret door opened. There was a heavy contrast between the modern building conventions of the church and what I saw beyond the threshold. It was made of stone and let down. There was a torch lit. A fucking torch. I noticed that the only reason the door opened so easily was because whoever ventured in last must have not noticed the door didn't completely catch. Otherwise, I may have not noticed it at all. I thought very hard on what I did next. I was in a place I was somewhat authorized to be, though not supposed to have known was there. I more than likely could check down those stairs, but for the life of me, I didn't want to. As far as I was concerned, I was not about to end up a horror trope and be right, but dead wrong. I looked for the door catch just to see how it theoretically would open, just so when I did close the door, I could place it back exactly how I found it. As unique as this situation turned out to be, I thought better to let it go than pursue this. I slowly returned to my guard shack with a secret. I watched Wayne's World 1 and 2 to keep my mind off the literal dungeon I found. I watched the cameras more attentively than I had in the past. I did not see those 2 men leave, which now threw into question if any of those that came through left. I wasn't about to start jumping to conclusions just because I didn't understand what was happening, and I'm sure that they were lost. The sun was cresting over the sky and it grew closer to quitting time. Since no one came to relieve me, I had to just punch out in front of the camera, and it was an outdated mechanical hole punch. I collected my things and hit my time card, though this was the first time in 5 years I actually felt inclined to stay. I decided against doing anything that I wouldn't do. At least things went relatively normal at work. After 2 weeks of straight work without break, I was starting to believe maybe none of it was as important as I was making it out to be, and it was just my mind making more out of things than it needed to. The next night started out with me watching Terminator and would move on to Terminator 2, and if I was still feeling it, I'd move on to Terminator 3. Halfway through Kyle Reese's monologue about how much he loved Sarah Connor, it happened again. The camera's going out, not the disappearing Mexican people. Helen walked a path towards the building with 2 more men, and the cameras that went out were strategic, ones that may give you a relative path down to the auditorium to the building. Though it only worked flawlessly when you put out all the correct cameras. It was as if someone just used their best guess to disable the cameras, but then again, even the people that employed me knew very little about what was happening day to day. Maybe it was all me just being paranoid. Regardless if I believed something was happening nefarious or not, the cameras were going out, so I had to venture back into the building. Except this time, after tonight, I was going to have to email my employers that this was not an isolated event, but an ongoing issue. I at the very least had to attempt to do the bare minimum version of doing my job. I figured that if I was in the place where they showed up, it wouldn't come off as me following them. So I double timed it to the auditorium, assuming that was where they'd show up. I beat them there and waited in the utility closet, leaving the door open a crack so that it wouldn't seem suspicious if it was open later. I watched the 3 make headway back behind the theater. As Helen opened the secret passage, one of the men stopped, very suspicious of what he was walking into. He spoke in Spanish in what I could only assume was a "oh hell no" type of way. Helen spoke with this 20-something man in his own language, and wasn't quite getting through whatever it was she was saying. The man started backing away. Helen was calm. She slowly pulled out one of her breasts from her bra. From my objective observational position, it felt a lot like an obvious manipulation, but filtered through the mind of a young man, it was a manipulation that had a very good chance of working. The young man grabbed Helen's breast and squeezed, but she briskly put it away. The hook had been baited. Even though I thought it was nefarious, seeing a tit made me rethink my entire perspective, which illustrated just how powerful boobs were. Maybe it literally was a sex dungeon, and I never saw any of the guys leave because they left at a time of day I didn't work. Helen obviously left at some point in the day. Couldn't she have just as easily brought these 2 with her? Maybe, just maybe, this was her kink and I stumbled onto it. I didn't have to assume it was a grand conspiracy. Though, even if it was just Helen getting her jollies in, was it my place to narc on her? I shook my head in disbelief, and I told myself that I was going to have to do one of 3 things to make this right. Come to Helen and just ask straight up, which I didn't want to do because if it's my word against hers, I'm gone. And worst case scenario, more of them are in on it, and then I know, and they cover it up and come at me to kill me. I scoffed at the thought. It wasn't anything other than her or a group of people banging down there. There was no secret cabals, or at least I told myself, because it was the most unlikely scenario. Or I could just go down there, and if I got caught, I'm pretty much fired if it goes the wrong way. Or I could just shut the fuck up and mind my own goddamn business, which was a popular and strong emotion that I tried to live by. At the end of the day, it was just a job, and how important was it? They came and they went. Even if it were a slim chance there was something odd going on down there, I should at the very least take a look. I wasn't going to make the mistake of saying how bad could it be, because it was quite obvious to someone with my level of creativity that it could easily be that bad. I crept to the secret passage in the prop room and pushed the little release that caused the door to slide open. The torch was lit the same as last time, and I descended and slowly spiraled downstairs. The smell became more and more intense, a distinct mist of sweat, animal smell, and a few other aromas that would have been offensive all by themselves, but was overwhelmed by the others. I was greeted by more torchlight the closer I got. If the lights completely failed, I'd be effectively blind. I could hear the moans of ecstasy a bit before I got to the bottom, so I assumed it was just a fucked in, and maybe my first thought was turning out to be correct. The room led out into a grander design. It felt like a church on top of a church. While upstairs was the clean face that was suitable for the masses, underneath was its seedy opposite. There were high ceilings and dark shadows behind pillars that made it look as if it were the abandoned halls of a Roman Senate. I quickly spread out and took cover behind a dark dais. There were the two men that Helen led down here. They were on an altar side by side with their dingy clothes thrown about the floor. Helen was on top of one of them and riding him like a horse, while the other waited at his side for his turn. Before I had any time to truly think about any of this as sexual, Helen robbed that thought from my head. From her back, she retrieved a long blade that was crooked as a lightning bolt. She plunged it into the man's heart. I assumed I couldn't get a good look at my angle, but he was unmoving except for the fountain of blood that sprayed Helen and the man's partner. It was the reluctant one that lived to see his friend slaughtered. He rolled off the altar to his feet and moved to restrain Helen, as vulnerable as he was in his birthday suit. I thought to hop out from the shadows and help the man until Helen's minion sprung up from the wings. Two men in black coats grabbed the man from behind. Helen smiled and drug that jagged blade over her titties like a gleeful psychopath in a movie. If I had hid on the other side of the room instead of the pillar I was in, those two would have come up directly behind me. The two men wrestled the young man down, one at the arms, the other at the legs. Helen assisted them when she could, without ever truly putting her knife down. I had a flashlight, and it was three of them, people who were clearly more than willing to kill, so I didn't reveal myself. I wanted to help this kid, but in the end, I had to declare that every man was for themselves. And it was lucky that I did, because moments after, they pinned their victim and strapped him to the leather handholds fashioned into the design of the dais. Two more cloaked figures revealed themselves from doorways I hadn't seen. I heard the bleating of a goat before I saw it. These two laid the now struggling goat on top of the altar, hovering over the live victim. It seemed as if the guy and the goat were both pretty confused on what was supposed to happen next. I watched in horror as more cloaked figures entered the room and began to spread out.